With all these tools that we've just acquired to solve equations, there is certain restrictions, certain limitations that we have. Now in mathematics, limitations, or what we can't do, is referred to as restrictions. Okay? So what we're going to do is take a look at the restriction that the main restriction actually, that we have in solving equations. And it's really related, and it is related to the real number set. If you remember, one of the first videos that we ever did was talking about the real number set and the boundary between natural numbers and whole numbers. And that boundary is basically us introducing the number 0 in our vocabulary for the language of mathematics, right? Initially we had the natural numbers, which is 1, 2, 3, all the way up to infinity. And then, we were able to define the number 0. And for this new discovery, we created a new subset, the whole number set, which included the natural numbers and, in addition, included 0, right? And when we're solving equations, this 0 comes up. This 0 comes up basically throughout mathematics. It's something that we haven't been able to deal with completely. So, it's going to create problems in a lot of things that we do. What we have to do is understand what those problems are, what those limitations are, what those restrictions are, right? And, that way we can understand how far we can go with things, right? What we're capable of doing. The problem when it comes to 0. As far as we know, as far as we're concerned, you can't divide by the number 0, right? Because when you divide by the number 0, our equations explode. Basically, you get infinity. We get an unknown. Okay. So what we have to do when we're solving equations is make note of where we have restrictions, where we have limitations. We have to know our limitations when we're solving equations. Okay. And in mathematics, a lot of courses initially, when you're solving equations, they're going to ask you to give the restrictions to your solution. For example, let's say we have something like, I'm going to use their chalks, little chalks. By the way, I've commandeered a classroom at UBC, okay? So hopefully there won't be anybody coming in and we can work here a little bit. So we're going to use a little chalk and an actual blackboard in a classroom to do this, these videos. So let's say we have something like this. Okay? 5 over 3 over. Let's say we had this equation and they asked us to solve this equation, okay? This is a general rule, you should always try to do this, okay? Before you start crunching numbers, moving numbers around and trying to solve an equation, you should take a look at the equation and list your restrictions, okay? The reason you want to do this is because at a certain point, when you're crunching, when you're trying to solve this equation, you might start losing some of the solutions, okay? So you have to keep note of your restrictions. As we stated in mathematics, one of our restrictions that we're going to have is we cannot divide by 0 because the equation explodes, right? So what we do with this equation, whenever we get an equation, if there's a fraction involved, all we do, we grab the denominator, right? And we say we can't divide by 0. So what we do is we solve for this not equaling 0, and that will be our restriction. Okay. So what we do, we take the denominator and we say 3x cannot equal 0. Because if 3x is equal to 0, that means the denominator is equal to 0, and we're dividing by 0, and we cannot divide by 0. Okay. So if you divide by 3. You divide by 3, 3 equals 3, so x cannot equal 0. Okay? And this is our restriction when we're solving for this equation. Now, this side also has an equal sign. And if this side also has a fraction, so you also have to take a look at this side and say, what's the restriction here? Now, the restriction here is exactly the same as the restriction here, because if you go 6x cannot equal 0, you divide by 6, so x cannot equal 0. So you get the same restriction for this side of the equation. Okay. So before we start crunching this equation, before we start solving this equation, we always try to list our restrictions. And what I personally do, and I think this is the general standard of the way things are done, is I always list my restrictions on the side. And what happens when you get more complicated equations, this is a straightforward equation, and there's only one restriction to this. When you get large equations, restrictions might pop up halfway through your solution. Okay? So what I end up doing is listing my restrictions on the side, on the right side of the piece of paper where I'm doing the work. And at the end, I look up the right side, and for my solution, I always list the restrictions. I just add them all up at the bottom. Okay? Not add them all up, but list them all at the bottom. So over here, I would say our restriction is x cannot equal 0. As we stated, our restriction is, comes out with the number 0, right? We cannot divide by 0. So before you would go ahead and start solving this equation, what you need to do is take the denominators from both sides. And if you had another term here, let's say you have 2 over x here, right? You have to take the denominators in every single term and say they cannot equal 0. So for example, for this one, it would be, let's do this in blue. For over here, you would go 5x minus 1 cannot equal 0. So 5x cannot equal 1. You just grab the 1, bring it over, right? Divide by 5, divide by 5. So x cannot equal 1 over 5. Okay? That's one restriction. That's for this term only. You have to deal with this one. Okay? For this one, you take each term and you say it cannot equal 0. You said the whole thing cannot equal to 0. So you're going to go x plus 1 times 2x minus 3 cannot equal 0. You got two things multiplied together to give you 0. That means each one you solve for not equaling 0. So x plus 1 cannot equal 0. 2x minus 3 cannot equal 0. Grab the 1, bring it over. So x cannot equal negative 1. And 2x minus 3 cannot equal, oops, very good. So 2x cannot equal 3, divide by 2, so x cannot equal 3 over 2. So those are 3 restrictions so far we have for this equation, and we also have over here. Well, over here it's just straightforward, x cannot equal 0. Okay. So before you even start looking at solving this equation, what you would do is write down all the restrictions on the right-hand side here. Okay. And all your restrictions are x cannot equal 0, x cannot equal 3 over 2, x cannot equal negative 1, and x cannot equal 1 over 5. Okay. And I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit for anyone who's gone far enough. These are going to be our vertical asymptotes if we're graphing the function, right? So these are unknowns, because if we set x equal to any single one of these in the above equation, we're going to have to divide by 0, and we don't know how to divide by 0.